Good morning, everyone, and welcome again to a national webinar from the National Institute for Occupational Health, the NIH. And we do this in collaboration with the Northwest University, supported by the Compensation Fund as part of the Department of Employment and Labor. So welcome to another online webinar. It's part of the webinar series of the NEDLAC and NIH COVID-19 Legacy Program, focusing on building capacity on occupational health and safety in our workplaces and to support all of those within the workplaces and outside of the workplace to improve the ability to keep workers, employees, and everybody in the workplace safe and healthy and not to have any fatalities. So our topic today is the guidance on the management of risk and risk assessments at places of work. And I want to thank the team here at the NIH. That's Professor Mzumkulu Zungu and Dr. Graham Chin for setting this all up, and in particular to Professor Jan du Plessis on behalf of the Northwest University team. So I'm going to now, as you've seen in the program, we've got quite a significant set of presenters from Professor Jan du Plessis, Dr. Stefan Linde, Professor Cas Badenhorst, Mr. Rian Badenhorst, Mr. Sean Chester, and Mr. Christo de Wet. That's going to deal with the series of topics that we have in the program. And without further delay, I'm going to hand over immediately to Professor Jan du Plessis, if he could just do the introduction on behalf of his team and the Northwest University. Over to you, Prof.
Good morning, everyone. From my side here, yes, thanks, Ashraf. I want to thank you for the introduction and welcome all the attendees. You have mentioned the Northwest University as being a primary partner in this, but it could not have been possible to develop this presentation without my colleagues. Prof. Cas Badenhorst and Dr. Stefan Linde, who's affiliated to the Northwest University. But then also we have Christo de Wet, Rian Badenhorst, and Sean Chester, who are really leaders in the field of occupational hygiene. So thank you for their part in this program as well. I think for now, I'm going to proceed with the introduction to this workshop. Just give me a minute just to share my screen and then I will start.
So a quick announcement while Prof is setting up, just a reminder to all attendees, please type your questions for the presenters in the question answer box. Do not use the question answer box for general good mornings and general administration. Specific questions to the content of the presentations of our presenters. If you've got any other general comment to make, please use the chat box. Or any other general admin or related questions. We have asked the presenters to focus and monitor on the question and answer box to answer all of your content specific questions. Thank you. Over to you, Prof.
Thank you. Ashraf, I just want to confirm you can see my screen.
Perfectly, yes, please proceed.
Okay.
Thank you.
Thank you. Okay, I just want to start off with a disclaimer. This webinar was initially developed with the aim to assist self-employed persons and owners of small, medium, and micro enterprises in risk assessment and the management process associated with this. So the idea is to create support to those who do not have access to or cannot afford comprehensive occupational health services. So this webinar should not be considered as an exhaustive for risk assessment and management processes, but rather as a foundation to increase the level of competency in the risk assessment and management process at places of work. So irrespective of the current level of competency, we hope to contribute to increase this competency. Furthermore, also we need to consider the legislative requirements and the complexity of places of work. Thereby, there is always a need to perform risk assessments, and there may be a possibility that a competent person must be roped in to help in conducting such a risk assessment. So please take note that this webinar or guidance does not exempt any employer from this statutory requirement. Okay, if we start off looking at risk assessment, as an employer, whether you are an owner of a small, medium and micro enterprise, or a self-employed person, or an employer in general, you are required by the Occupational Health and Safety Act and its regulations to protect your employees and others from harm at the place of work. This risk assessment is just one part of the risk management process, which is used to eliminate or reduce health and safety risks in the place of work and to improve the overall health, safety, and well-being of your employees. The minimum that you as an employer must do consists of taking reasonable steps to eliminate or to reduce any hazard or potential hazard to the safety and or health of your employees before resorting to the use of personal protective equipment. This means that you should organize your place of work and your work procedures in such a way that it will not negatively affect the safety and health of your employees. This includes that you need to identify what could cause accidents, injuries, or illness or disease at this place of work. You need to decide how likely it is that someone could be harmed by these hazards, and if so, how serious. And then you need to take action to eliminate the hazard, or if not possible, to reduce the risk in your place of work. So our aim is really to assist employers or owners of SMMEs or self-employed persons in implementing basic health and safety risk assessment procedures, and to help prioritize the implementation of control measures to eliminate or reduce health and safety risks. So we want to really assist in that you can eliminate or reduce work-related accident, injuries, and illnesses and diseases at your places of work. So we hope that after completion of this webinar this morning, that you will be able to implement a basic risk management program by following the 5 different steps that we will deal with. Thank you very much. Stefan.
Thank you, Prof. Johan, and good morning to everyone. I am going to go through some of the definitions we are using in the webinar. Obviously, when it comes to legislation, definitions are very important. So yeah, I'm going to go through some of the important definitions. The first one is what we call a competent person. Now, Prof. Johan mentioned earlier that a competent person may be brought in to do a more complicated risk assessment. Now, what is this competent person? So the Department of Employment and Labour has compiled a document that we will look at now that helps define a competent person. And this is basically someone that has the correct or the required knowledge, training, and experience in a specific field, and who is familiar with the Occupational Health and Safety Act and its regulations. So when we talk about a competent person, it's someone who has the correct amount of knowledge, training, and experience in a certain field. So if you are looking at hazardous chemicals, noise, there will be specific competencies for those fields. And it is important to remember that a competent person will change. So someone who does an ergonomic risk assessment in an office You may have someone who is competent to do that because they have basic training, basic knowledge, etc. But when it comes to more difficult circumstances, like in a packing warehouse where people lift things the whole day, the competency for that scenario may be different from an office situation. So a competent person is basically a person who has the specific knowledge, training, and experience for a specific situation, and that may change from scenario to scenario. Next slide, please. Okay, so this is when you click on that link. This is the guideline from the Department of Employment and Labour that will give you more information if you need it. Next slide. Okay, so the next term, consequence or severity of exposure, is very important for today's webinar. So a consequence is an injury or illness or disease following exposure to a hazard, and that can be either high, medium, or low. So when we talk about consequence, it is that inherent consequence to an exposure. So we all know, for example, that asbestos is very dangerous, causes asbestosis, etc. So it has a high consequence, a high severity of exposure, whereas, for example, working with dishwashing soap isn't that dangerous. So it has a low consequence if you are exposed to a lot of washing soap. So consequence, when we talk about consequence or severity, it's that inherent injury or disease linked with exposure, and it can be either high, very dangerous, or medium or low. Next slide, please. Okay, so exposure just means that you are exposed to a certain hazard while at your place of work. We will talk about hazard in a moment, but it just means that you are exposed to something dangerous. Exposure route is also something to take note of, and the exposure route refers to the site where a hazard enters the body. So, for example, if a substance is in the air, like airborne dust or a vapor or something in the air, you can inhale it. It enters the body through the lungs, and it can spread to the body like that. The skin is also a route of exposure. Skin contact with an acid or something that can enter the body through the skin. Then ingestion. We all know that when you eat something that's contaminated with bacteria or something, that it can enter the body and it can cause disease. And then injection. For example, if you have an open cut on your hands and you are exposed to a chemical or a virus, it can enter the body through there. So why this is important is that the specific route of entry, how a substance or a biological agent or whatever enters the body, is very important in how we control that or reduce that exposure. If you can only inhale something like a dangerous dust, then you aren't going to wear a full body suit to protect the skin, because it can't enter through the skin. You will wear a respirator, for example, to prevent inhalation. So knowing the exposure route of a substance, how it can enter the body, is very important, because that will determine how we control, how we reduce that exposure. So that's what we mean when we say exposure route. Next slide, please. Then hazard, I referred to hazard earlier, and a hazard can be anything that has a potential to cause harm. So it's anything at work that has the potential to cause harm. So, for example, if you enter a confined space, a poorly ventilated room, there's a chance you can be exposed to a high concentration of a substance. If you are a machine that makes excessive noise, that can be a hazard. Extreme temperatures, like the cold temperatures we are experiencing a day, is a hazard. It has a potential to cause harm if you're working outside in the early mornings. Hazardous chemicals, inadequate illumination, inadequate ventilation, or manual tasks that causes awkward body positions, that has the potential to cause harm. It's not necessarily that it will cause harm, but it has the potential to cause harm. Then we have psychological hazards and safety hazards. My colleagues will give much more information on all of these hazards a bit later on, but just know that a hazard is something that has the potential to cause harm. Next slide, please. Then the term reasonably practicable is a favorite of mine, because it appears through the entire Occupational Health and Safety Act and regulations. So according to the Occupational Health and Safety Act, every employer shall provide and maintain, as far as is reasonably practicable, a working environment that is safe and without risks to their workers. So what does this reasonably practicable mean? It basically means that this is what a reasonable person would do. How far would a reasonable person go to maintain a workplace that is safe and without risk? Obviously, some work does have a certain amount of risk connected to it, but how would a reasonable person go to reduce that amount of risk? And we talk about it in four main categories. So a reasonable person would take into consideration the severity and scope of the hazard or risk. They would take into consideration the state of knowledge available about that hazard. They would take into consideration the availability and suitability of means to remove that hazard, and then finally the cost. So if there is a hazard present in the workplace, it will be reasonably practicable to take into consideration how dangerous is it. So something like asbestos, like I said, is much more dangerous than dishwashing soap. So a reasonable person would take more measures to reduce the risk to asbestos exposure compared to something like dishwashing soap. So the severity of the consequence of exposure is something you take into consideration. Then the knowledge available. Is there knowledge available that this thing is dangerous? Yes, for asbestos, there is a lot of knowledge available. So you take that into consideration. For example, during COVID-19, at the beginning, there wasn't a lot of knowledge available, but as the research developed, as knowledge developed, then there were a lot more knowledge available, and there were a lot more information about how to reduce the risk, how to mitigate it. So as the time went on, a reasonable person would have started to implement these controls to reduce exposure to COVID-19, because the knowledge was and the information was there. Then the availability and suitability. So if there is a way in which you can reduce exposure, then a reasonable person would try to do that. So it just means that if there is availability and suitability of a means to remove or mitigate that hazard, then a reasonable person would take that chance and implement those measures. And lastly, cost. Cost is often the major thing people think about, but the cost of mitigating a hazard, maybe implementing more cost-effective measures first, and then moving to more costly measures. That is, cost is also something you have to take into consideration. So when we talk about it is reasonably practicable to reduce the risk to a hazard, we are basically saying, are you taking the severity and scope of the hazard, the knowledge available, the ability to reduce exposure, and the cost? Are you taking that into consideration when you are acting? Are you doing what a reasonable person would do? And yeah, that is the definition of reasonably practicable. Next slide, please. Right, risk assessment, what we are busy with a day. It's the process of evaluating risks to health, to safety and health from workplace hazard, and then implementing a systemic examination of all aspects regarding that risk. So it's when you are doing a risk assessment, you are evaluating the risk, you are examining the level of the risk, and you are looking at three things: what could cause injury or harm, whether these hazards can be eliminated, and what preventative or protective measures are and should be in place to control the risk. So you're looking at what could potentially cause harm. Can that measure or can that hazard be eliminated? And if not, you are looking how can you control it to as low as you possibly can. So that is what we are busy with today: evaluating risks and seeing and examining how you can reduce it. Risk management is just this process of identifying, assessing, and controlling risks to health and safety of workers. So it's the process of how you manage your risks. How do you identify it, assess it, and control it at the end of the day? And that is what my colleagues will talk a lot more about. Then the term risk, we've talked a lot about risk. So the definition thereof is the risk is the chance that somebody may be harmed by the hazard. So we talked about the hazard, that the hazard is something that can potentially cause harm, not necessarily, but potentially cause harm. Now the risk is the chance of that hazard causing harm. So the risk increases as exposure to the hazard increases. So for example, there are a lot of cars on the road, and the car is a hazard. So if you are a pedestrian, the car is a hazard that can potentially harm you. But if you are walking on the sidewalk, the risk is very low because the chance of that hazard hitting you is low. But if you are walking in the middle of the road, your risk increases because your exposure to that hazard, you are very close to the car, and that's where your risk increases. The hazard stays the same. The hazard stays the hazard, but the risk, your chance of being hit by the car, that increases. So we can implement that in any scenario. If you are exposed to noise, the closer you are to that noise, those high noise levels, and the more you are exposed to it, the higher the risk is. So when we talk about risk, it's the chance of you being harmed by the hazard that has an inherent potential to harm. Okay, and then a self-employed person is just someone who works for themselves rather than working for an employer that pays a regular wages or salary. So self-employed person, a person who works for themselves. And when we talk about SMMEs, we talk about small, medium, and micro enterprises. Next slide. Okay, that's my story about the definitions. Are there any questions at this stage? You are welcome to raise your hand.
Hi, Stefan. Ashraf here. I'm going to activate the hand raising facility now.
Okay.
There are some questions in the question answer box if you just want to perhaps have a quick look at that.
Okay. Okay, let me just see. If someone bent down to warm food during lunch in a microwave, and afterwards when the person come to upright position, experience low back pain, does it qualify as an IOD? Well, I'm not exactly sure how to answer that. I don't know if any of my colleagues can answer that one. I think someone raised their hand. Sorry.
Hi, Stefan. I can come in on that.
Yes. Okay. Thanks, Sean.
Yeah, I think, I mean, again, this goes through to the risk assessment to see whether that it would actually qualify as a risk, and then if there is an injury that actually comes from something where somebody's just lifting their own body weight from a very low position, that would have to be sort of investigated as an IOD potentially, and it could be classified as that if those criteria are met, that it actually would be related or correlated to that activity. So, for example, the person bent down and they picked up the entire microwave to put it on top of a kitchen counter from below their knees, that would potentially qualify as an IOD. However, if somebody's got a pre-existing back condition and they've been into the clinic and they actually are just not even lifting anything of any weight, that would probably not qualify as an IOD.
Okay, thank you for that. Then there's another question. Risk assessment is conducted by a competent person. Appeals are done as per section 35. Yet this is not accepted. I think that the whole competent person thing is you have to be able to prove that the person is competent to do a certain thing. So yeah, I think if that is the most important thing. How do you prove that someone has the appropriate knowledge, training, etc., to do a specific risk assessment? And that's basically where the whole competent person thing comes in. I think there's something from Ashraf.
Stefan, yes, we've got a Punyezwa and an Ilana who wants to ask a question. I'm going to ask Punyezwa to start first and to keep it brief. Punyezwa, if you can unmute. Okay, Punyezwa is struggling. Ilana, do you want to ask your question? Ilana Kluter, can you unmute? Okay, I'm not sure if the colleagues as attendees, and then there's Nick van Niekerk. Nick, you can unmute.
Good morning. Can you hear me, Ashraf?
Please
Yes.
proceed.
Yeah. So, Johan, I think that previous question that you've answered is actually in relation to an earlier question that I've posted around certain DOL inspectors that makes or blatantly just issues a contravention notice during certain inspections. And when you do show them, or the contravention notice in respect of issuing PPE, and when you take them through the actual risk assessment that you've done and you showed them that your administrative controls that has been put into place actually mitigates the risk to an acceptable level, they don't agree with that, and they just blatantly want you to issue PPE to people. And if you take a company that's 35,000 strong and you have to issue safety boots to all 35,000, that's considering that cost, that's not reasonable, practicable. How do we work around those type of issues? And hence I said in section 35 we appeal, but then it's sometimes not accepted or just pushed off the table. Thanks.
Thank you.
Yeah, I don't know if one of the colleagues wants to answer that, but yeah, I'm not yeah, I unfortunately cannot answer why they would do that. Sorry. I think maybe some of my colleagues in the later sessions can allude to that further, maybe.
Yeah, Stefan, we've got little time left.
Yes.
I see that we have, was it Sean who may wanted to say something there briefly?
Yeah, thanks. I think Ashraf, Nick, it's a really difficult question now to answer, because now you're dealing with Department of Employment and Labour inspectorates, and they've got their own ways of doing things. I don't know if there's an inspectorate, a principal inspector in the session over here today in the audience. But obviously, if the risk assessment is has achieved its objectives and has been done by a competent person, the agreement should be that the findings of that risk assessment would stand and would surpass the notice. So the notice would obviously then have to be challenged formally. And then I think you just let that process play itself out. I mean, I wouldn't go out and spend millions of rands on PPE if the risk assessment actually doesn't really define that needs to be done. And then you would actually let that sort of play out as it goes, I would imagine. But certainly I find, in terms of the Department of Employment and Labour and the inspectorate, certainly in Pretoria, whether it's Warren and Release or Balewa or anything, are very reasonable, and they do understand that, I suppose, these things happen on the ground. But I think if it had to escalate all the way up to the top, you'd find that there would be reasonability within all that. That's just my opinion. It might not be correct, but yeah, that's what I think. Thanks.
Thanks, Sean. I've got three hands. Stefan Beito, blessings to Kwara and Elvis Malaji. We won't be able to do more than those three hands. And very briefly, if that's okay, we are running slightly over time. If I could ask you, Stefan Beito, to unmute and just quickly ask your question. Be brief, thanks.
Morning, everybody. Okay, just going back to the concept of the competent person. I noticed within the different regulations, there's a term used that they say knowledge, training, and experience. Now, aside from your noise-induced hearing loss and your GMR, the definition stays fairly the same. My question is, GMR, competent person, there's 4 criteria. Must all 4 criteria be met, or is it where the other says and knowledge, is this A or B or C or D must be met?
Thank you for the question. I think it depends on what the task is, what the specific situation is. I heard a comment from an inspector the other day saying that exactly that it depends on what the situation is, and I think you have to reasonably prove all of those the knowledge, the training, and the experience based on the situation that you are dealing with. I hope that answers the question.
Sorry, Stefan, I know we're running out of time. Could I come in quickly on that as well?
Yeah.
Just to support that too. It's all about the complexity of the situation. If you're dealing with, like, let's call it a carcinogen that actually needs very little chemical exposure to maybe progress a disease, or let's say asbestos or whatever, obviously your competency level would maybe not be found in-house, but you might find that it's might be somebody climbing a ladder where it takes a lot of logic. And then you'd find that you could assess that risk in-house, and you would imagine that you'd be able to address it quite easily within just a little panel within, like, maybe a safety rep and a manager and a supervisor and an actual worker themselves, and you come out with a risk around that. So yeah, it really is to do with the complexity. So certainly supporting what Stefan's saying. Thank you.
Thank you. There's two other hands, Blessings and Elvis. Is it okay if we proceed with that, Stefan, before we go over to the next topic by Prof. Bardanos?
You are in control. I'm
okay.
I'm fine.
Thanks. Blessing, can you keep your question just quickly short? We're running out of time on the session.
All right. Mine was not a question. It was just a comment in regards to what the previous speaker spoke about. I think it was in relation with the Department of Labour's inspectors. to just comment based on an audit point of view to say every inspector is different. They come with different knowledge, experience, and their perceptions are also different, including their judgment. So any notice, or whether it's a contravention or it's a prohibition that is issued, can also be appealed, because once you have diverging opinions, which is the opinion of the employer and the opinion of the inspector, it means now that you have a diverging opinion, and normally it needs to be taken to an external person or another person, or you can appeal to the chief inspector to say, okay, this is what we have in place and this is what this inspector is saying, and then they'll be able to assess whether what your mitigation measures are saying are reasonable or they are not. So yeah, everything is guided by your risk assessment though. So I think it also depends on what your risk assessment says. If it has if it has not addressed any need for PPE, then maybe that would be the reason why the inspector would suggest that. But if it has been addressed and then maybe the inspector is being unreasonable, you can appeal the notice that has
Thanks,
been
Blessing.
issued. Thank you.
Thanks, Blessing. Alvis, just the last person, briefly. Thanks.
Hello, everyone. Can you hear me?
Yes, please proceed. You got 30 seconds.
All right, thank you. Actually, my question is answered. We can proceed. Thank you.
Thank you, Alvis. And with that, we are now going to proceed over to the next session, Prof. And that, Prof. du Plessis, we are going to Prof. Cas Badenhorst. Over to you.
Good morning, everybody. At least want to show my face and that you're not talking to a bot or something. Then if it's acceptable, I'll close my camera just to save some bandwidth and proceed to my slide. Thanks, Johan. So I'm going to start going whilst Johan changes the slides. The recognition of health hazards in the workplace is fundamental to their proper control. Occupational disease still occurs because employees and their workers are often ignorant about the hazardous nature of materials or processes in their particular workplaces. Health hazards often arise from unexpected sources, as well as from well-documented ones. If no attempt is made to establish the existence of such hazards, control may be haphazard or even non-existent. Despite what has been learned about workplace health, some employers still do not appreciate the dangers of well-known health hazards such as asbestos, lead, or pesticides. The physical environment where work takes place can cause health impacts in the following ways: physical injuries from accidents involving moving machinery, movement of products, etc. Musculoskeletal disorders associated with various work activities, for example, where manual handling is a feature, repetitive motion is required, or whole body vibration occurs. Noise-induced hearing loss associated with occupational-related excessive noise exposure, and arm vibration syndrome and other musculoskeletal consequences from hand-arm transmitted vibrations, skin cancer from working outdoors in direct sunlight, effects from both ionizing and non-ionizing radiation, for example, cataracts, heat exhaustion, hypothermia, and various other health effects from exposures to extremes of temperatures. Exposure to some of the major hazardous substances encountered in our workplaces can also result in a number of important health effects. These could include, but are not limited to, skin disorders, such as skin burns, contact dermatitis, and cancers of the skin, from contact with a wide range of chemicals, including acids, alkalis, solvents, fuels, lubricants, and resins. Acute pneumonia may result from exposure to fumes, damage to the respiratory system from exposure to airborne chemicals such as dust, gases, aerosols, mist, and fumes, and damage to internal organ systems such as lung, liver, kidney, bone marrow, and brain from absorption of chemicals and metals through the skin, respiratory, and digestive system. Risk assessments therefore needs to, or risk assessment is performed to identify those hazards, including those associated with all work environments activities, to assess whether workers are exposed to these hazards, to categorize the risk and the controls, with the ultimate aim to eliminate or mitigate work-related risk, to implement controls according to the hierarchy of controls, and to provide PPE where higher order controls do not effectively reduce the risk. And at the end, risk assessments are a continuous process to drive continuous improvement in workplace environments. The risk assessments involve 4 key elements: identification of hazards and their sources, estimation of potential for exposure and the related health effects, quantification of those exposures, assessment of the risk, and then how to control those risks. A risk assessment, therefore, as indicated on this slide, is a structured and systematic identification and analysis of workplace hazards with the aim of reducing the risk of exposure to these hazards through the development and implementation of measures to prevent release of the hazards and to mitigate the effects of exposure should it occur. My colleagues will now take you through these various steps in the next part of the presentations. Thank you, Astrid.
Thanks, Prof. Badenhorst. And step 2, we are going to proceed with Mr. Sean Chester. Over to you, Sean.
Good morning, colleagues. Also, let me just show my video as well so you can see my face. Good morning, everybody. Thank you to my esteemed colleagues, Stefano and Cas, for introducing the concepts of risk assessments. My job is to just go through how we get to that point where we risk ranking. I'll switch my video off now to save bandwidth. So really the quintessential part of what we are doing over here is to get to this point where we can assess the risk and we can actually give it a ranking from very low to medium to high. And so it actually requires us firstly to understand the terminology, which we've already been introduced to, understanding what a hazard is, understanding what a risk is, understanding how to assign. Yes.
We skipped Rian. He was supposed to present step 1. I think.
True. Okay, let's go back there. I'll stop my share. All right.
Right.
My sincerest apologies.
Good morning, everyone. Can you hear me?
Rian, do you want me to share the slide or will you share from your side?
Johan, if you can share it, that would be fantastic. Yeah, so while Johan is getting the slide ready, there we go. I just want to say good morning, everybody. I see we've got over 900 participants, which I think is truly fantastic, and applaud you all for attending a webinar such as this in order to improve the health situations at your workplaces. So I'm going to do the identification of hazards in the workplace, which is the first step in the risk assessment process, and it's actually very easy. It's easy to identify the hazards, but then also it's easy to miss a few hazards. But I'll elaborate on that a bit later. So let's begin by discussing some of the most common hazards found in the workplaces across the various industries. While the specific hazards may vary depending on the nature of the work, some general categories include the physical hazards, chemical hazards, biological hazards, and psychosocial hazards. And then also we've got safety hazards there as well. So I'm just going to elaborate on each of these categories, starting with physical hazards. Now, these are health hazards referring to anything in your surroundings that can physically harm your body. So these hazards can cause injuries, illnesses, or damage to your overall well-being. Some of these would include, for example, noise, where loud noises from machinery, equipment, or construction sites can harm your hearing and cause long-term damage to your hearing systems. Temperature extremes such as heat stress or cold stress, where heat stress can lead to heat stroke, and working in cold environments can lead to frostbite. Vibration, where continuous exposure to vibrating tools or equipment like jackhammers or power tools can lead to conditions like hand-arm vibration syndrome. And then also ergonomic hazards, where poorly designed workstations or improper body positioning during work can cause muscle strain, repetitive strain injuries, and back problems. So these were just a few examples. I'm just going to list a few for each category. Going next is the chemical hazards. And a chemical hazard is a substance or chemical that can be harmful to your body if you come into contact with them. Some of these categories include toxic substances, such as cleaning products or pesticides, where the chemicals can be poisonous if they enter your body through inhalation, ingestion, or skin contact. You also get irritants, where such as strong acids and solvents and certain fumes, where these substances can cause irritation or inflammation to your skin, eyes, or respiratory system. There's corrosive substances that can damage or destroy materials that they come into contact with, including your skin and your eyes, such as strong acids and bases. You get chemical allergens. Usually you get it in fragrances or dyes and latex, like wearing latex gloves, for example, in the health industry, where certain chemicals in these products can trigger allergic reactions to certain individuals, leading to symptoms like skin rashes, difficulty breathing, or other allergic responses. Then, like Sean mentioned earlier, carcinogens, which prolonged exposure to certain chemicals such as asbestos or certain industrial chemicals can lead to the risk of the development of cancer. Then there's also flammable or combustible materials such as gasoline, solvents, and certain gases, where substances can catch fire or explode when exposed to ignition source, such as flames or sparks. Moving over to biological hazards, which are living organisms or substances that can cause harm or illness to your body. These hazards are often related to bacteria, viruses, fungi, parasites, or any other biological agent. A few examples would be infectious diseases like the flu, the common cold. These are illnesses caused by pathogenic microorganisms, such as bacteria or viruses, and they can spread from person to person through contact, airborne transmission, or contaminated surfaces. You get mold and fungi. Mold and fungi are microscopic organisms that can grow in damp environments. Exposure to mold spores or fungal toxins can lead to respiratory issues, allergies, skin irritation. Animal-borne hazards, such as where the waste products can carry harmful bacteria, viruses, or parasites. Examples include ticks with Lyme disease, mosquitoes, carrying malaria or dengue fever, or contaminated animal waste that you especially get in the agricultural settings. Now, just like chemical hazards, biological hazards also have allergens, such as pollen, dust mites, or animal dander that can trigger allergic reactions in sensitive individuals. And then another one I want to bring up is blood-borne pathogens, where they are infectious microorganisms found in blood and other bodily fluids. These can be transmitted through contact with contaminated blood, needles, or sharps. And examples of these pathogens include hepatitis B, hepatitis C, or HIV. Moving over to psychosocial hazards, which is one of the lesser addressed ones. But psychosocial hazards refer to factors in our social and psychological environment that can affect our mental well-being and overall health. Now, these, like I said, this is not general one it's generally discarded because it's not something you can physically see, such as, for example, a wet floor that can lead to slip and falls. Some examples include excessive work demands, like when the workload is overwhelming or the expectations are unrealistic, it can lead to chronic stress, burnout, and negative impacts on mental well-being. Other examples are bullying or harassment, where being subjected to persistent mistreatment, bullying, or harassment can have severe psychological effects, including anxiety, depression, and low self-esteem. There is high-pressure environments, where competitive environments, constant pressure to perform can lead to chronic stress and negatively impact mental health. Discrimination and equality, where experiencing discrimination or unequal treatment based on factors such as race, gender, or ethnicity can have significant psychological and emotional impacts. And then also, lastly, the safety hazards such as, like I said earlier, slippery surfaces or sharp edges, broken pieces of glass, easily identifiable hazards. Now, how can we effectively identify these hazards in the workplaces? I narrowed it down to 2 steps, which is to anticipate and recognize hazards. So the first step is to anticipate the hazard, which is easily done without physically going into your workplace. You can do it even there where you sit right now. This is just where you sit back and you think, what do you know already of these hazards? As soon as you go into your work environment, these hazards you will find. This can also be done, especially these days, it's a lot easier with the various search engines on the internet, where you can, narrow it down to your specific field. For example, if you are working at a gas station, a petrol station, you can easily type in hazards associated with working in the petrochemical industry or at the gas station. And these will give you the general hazards that you might come into contact with in your specific field. But as all workplaces, even though the same work is being done, all workplaces are still unique. The buildings are unique, the locations on where you find yourself is unique, and the area where you find yourself. And that is when you go into the next step, which is the recognition. That is where you physically go into your own workplace, and you go through it by doing inspections and assessments. You can start by examining the physical environment, the equipment, and the work processes. You can look for potential hazards, such as faulty machinery, inadequate lighting, or slippery floors. You can consult safety data sheets and labels to understand the potential risk associated with chemicals used in your specific workplace. Additionally, you can observe employee workstations and practices to identify ergonomic issues or psychosocial stresses. So what I'm actually getting at is when you go physically to your workplace and you take a piece of paper and a clipboard and you start and you go through your whole work area and you identify hazards. I find it easier to start from the outside and you do a perimeter check around your place of work, and then you work yourself from outside in, where you go from room to room or area to area, and then systematically work through your whole business and identify the hazards in each room or each space. Now, this hazard identification doesn't stop with physical inspections. Like I said earlier, it's easy to miss hazards. And there's a question I saw in the question box as well, and I want to address this. It's important to involve employees in the process as well. Proper hazard identification is usually done in a team setting. We as individuals, we tend to focus on that which we are coming in contact with on a daily basis. And not all of us are doing the same jobs or the same roles in the workplace. So to have all your employees together, your co-workers, and they are invaluable resource of information, as they often have first-hand knowledge and experience regarding the workplace hazards in which they get in contact with on a daily basis. So yeah, thank you for moving the slide along, Johan. So here's some considerations that you can use when you do hazard identification in your place of work. I'm going to run through them. You can ask yourself, how do employees work and how is the equipment used? What substances and chemicals are used? Are general work practices safe or unsafe? Do non-routine tasks such as maintenance or change in production change the risk to employees? What accidents and illnesses may have happened in your place of work in the past? How can employees, contractors, and visitors be harmed if exposed to each of the hazards that were identified? Are there any vulnerable employees, such as new and experienced employees, pregnant or lactating mothers, all employees and employees making use of chronic medication that may be more vulnerable to negative effects of exposure? And then talk to employees, but not only employees. You can talk to your clients, talk to visitors, talk to any individual that comes into contact with your business. Can they help with identifying hazards that you may have missed? Next slide, please. Okay, so now so I'm going to refer to table 3.1, which is going to start with the following slide. It may be used as a template for the risk assessment process. So this table we're going to use for the rest of this workshop. My colleagues are going to use it as well. And I'm going to focus on the hazard identification portion, which will be highlighted in pink. And then just 2 key facts to remember. In order to enable effective record keeping, which will be explained later on in this workshop, it is essential that the company name and the date of the assessment and the details of the person or persons or team conducting the risk assessment be recorded on each page of the risk assessment. And examples of physical, chemical, biological, psychological, and safety hazards are provided in table 3.1 with potential risk factors. Okay, let's move to the next slide, please, Johan. So here's an example of how a risk assessment will look on paper, that you can carry with you throughout your hazard identification process. So as you'll see there on top, you can put your company name, your date of the assessment, and the assessment done by. And then column 1, the categories, like I explained earlier, you can systematically label each of the hazards you find. So I'm not going to run through each and every one, but I'll go through as many as possible. So you'll see the hazard category for physical hazards such as noise, and then identify the risk where you could potentially identify in your workplace you are using angle grinders or drills, which can lead to discomfort or hearing damage. Let's go to ergonomics, another hazard category, which is a physical hazard. The specific hazard is ergonomics and body and muscle pains from handling heavy objects, doing repetitive tasks, and using awkward positions. Another physical one I'll go down is poor ventilation, where the increased exposure to hazardous chemicals or biological agents indoors due to closed windows or no ventilation system that brings in fresh air from the inside. Next slide, please, Johan. Let's move away from the physical and we can go to the chemical. Chemical hazards such as gases and vapors, for example, where respiratory irritation or dizziness following spray painting can occur, like in the automotive business or carpentry. Welding fumes, also respiratory irritation or fever from welding. Biological viruses, COVID-19 or flu after being infected by employees. Mold, damp and moldy environments can cause irritation of the airways, eyes and skin. You'll especially get mold in wet areas like a leaky roof. You'll start to see the roof showing signs of mold. You'll get it in bathrooms as well, especially air conditioners, around air conditioning stations, easily identifiable. Psychosocial, long hours, exhaustion from work, and safety, slip and trips, where bruises and cuts and fractures from slipping and spilled liquids or slippery surfaces. So this is just an indication on this tool that you're going to use to do risk assessment at your own place of work, to systematically start breaking down the hazard, where you can categorize it, you can specifically talk about the hazard, and then what that hazard is going to, the cause of that hazard, what you predict will happen to being exposed to that hazard at your place of work. I think that's it from my side. So I just want to finish off with saying that hazard identification, it's not a one-time task, but it's an ongoing process. The workplace conditions can change. New hazards can emerge on a, even on a daily basis, not necessarily on an annual basis or monthly basis. So regular reviews and inspections should be conducted to ensure that new hazards are promptly identified and addressed. But I'm sure this will be covered by my colleagues later in this workshop. So that's it from my side. Thank you, Ashraf.
Thank you very much, Riaan Badenhorst, and my apologies.
Ashraf, you are muted.
Yes, my apologies.
I think I wanted to mute myself and then I unmuted Ashraf. My apologies, Ashraf.
Great. Okay. So, apologies to you, Riaan Badenhorst, because of the two surnames, Prof. Cas Badenhorst as well. I skipped you, unfortunately, so my apologies to you, and apologies to Sean Chester for that little glitch. We're going to step 2. I must just tell Sibusiso, Minimoyo, Sidika, Makamba, and Wendy Ngubane, we're not going to deal with your questions immediately. We're going to go to step 2 so that Mr. Sean Chester can just deal with the assessing the risk of being exposed to hazards, and then we will deal with questions after that. Over to you, Sean.
Thank you, Ashraf. Appreciate that. Starting again, Riaan, thank you very much for a very good job and introduction. It makes my job a lot easier, recognizing that now the hazards are properly loaded into everybody's minds, and the idea of anticipation and recognition are in there as well. So, that's the big thing about a hazard. We know we come across them every day, whether we're getting into our car and driving, or we skipping over a hole, dodging a pothole, or whatever it is. So we need to identify that those hazards are there. And then secondly, we need to actually see what is the likelihood or probability that those hazards are going to be experienced by us as people that interact with them. And then the third thing we need to have a look at is what will happen? What is the probability of that happening? And then we finally put that risk ranking together. So what we start off with the idea that we identify the employees at risk and the existing control measures. And those control measures, the more of them that are in place to mitigate that risk, the more the greater the potential for that risk to be lowered. So if you just think about an example using your car again, if you are driving and it's really hazardous, but the road markings are well laid out, everybody's well behaved, your tires are new, your car is serviced, and there's no potholes, then obviously that mitigates the risk to you and to your vehicle. So we actually, once we're identifying these hazards, we follow the hazard identification, followed with this hazard identification phase. Then if we're looking at that hazard, we've got to ask these questions. How can someone be harmed? How badly could they be harmed? Who might be harmed? And what measures are already in place to prevent that harm? And we'll go through that as we progress this. So the first thing we need to do in terms of the law, and it's written in blood, and it's the way that the international community, doesn't matter whether we're enforcing through the Occupational Health and Safety Act or through the Mining Health and Safety Act or any kind of act that is looking at risk to health and safety, or even environment, we'll be using these same parameters of probability and severity. So they're really important for you to load in and understand that they actually do firstly occur on a continuum. So we go from low, medium to high, and on both the probability and the severity. And that we look at the intersects between these two things. So something that might have a very low probability, but a very high severity. So if you consider somebody doing mountain climbing, the probability of them falling is probably fairly high. And the severity of them falling would be fairly high. So that would be a high risk. So if we take that and we relate it back to our workplaces, it could just be a hole in the floor, it could be a slippery floor, it could be a chemical exposure, it could be a biohazard, it could be anything like that. And we just have to look at addressing them on these scales of probability and severity. So what we do is we look at how likely, how probable is it that someone is to be harmed, and how serious would it be? So it's pretty obvious and pretty self-explanatory. And it really does give you a very nice way of looking at the risks inside your organization, from the kind of the fence line, as Riaan said, all the way through to your high-risk tasks in the center of your organization, where there's a lot of sort of energy being put into the machinery, stamping, welding, drilling, whatever it is. So we consider the following. What is the likelihood of the injury, illness resulting from exposure? So in the law, doesn't matter which act we're using, because we were asked inside the Q&A, does this relate to Mining Health and Safety Act as well? And the answer is very specifically yes. So we're always going to be looking at that likelihood. And then what will be this? What are the severe consequences? How severe are they? And then we go across these parameters from low risk to medium risk to high risk, and we look at those intersects. So very important for us to understand the probability and severity scales. So then we're really going to start looking at this risk ranking. So, it's very nice to be able to look at your organization. And if you think back to those tables that Riaan presented, and we'll be looking at those in a little bit more detail under this section as well, and we'll be progressing them. If you look at that risk ranking, what we really want to do is we actually want to look at a macro view of our organization, and we can actually see that we look at by department, by task, by activity or whatever, and then we can actually then break our organization up into high, medium, and low risk activities, and then we can address them like that. So we use this by using the risk ranking scale. So with that, we consider both the probability and the severity. The assignments of risk rankings assist in the prioritization of risks and informs action plans to deal with the highest risks first. So if we've done our work properly and competently, we'll end up with a breakdown through our organization that goes mentions each one of those tasks by name, and we progress that through. We put a probability scale, a severity scale. We look at that intersect, and then we'll come up with a risk rating or a risk ranking, and it'll be high, medium, or low. So just in terms of notes, the SMME owner or self-employed person must determine which technique will work best for each of these situations. You might want to use a technique that actually specifically, if you've got a lot of safety hazards inside your organization, you might want to use a risk ranking scale that works better for you. If you want something a little bit more advanced, you might want to use a scale that goes from very low to very high, like maybe a 4 or 5 point scale. The one that we're presenting today is just one example of so many different types of risk rankings there. And I think this one, the one that we've got after lots of thoughts, is definitely the easiest for sort of the majority of SMME type of basic assessments to be able to cough out the types of answers that you need in risk rankings that you need to be able to prioritize and develop action plans. If the risks in the workplace are unclear, then an objective judgment by a competent person might be necessary. Now, your competent person may not be in your organization. It might be an engineer looking at scaffolding, say, for example, or load-bearing activities or something like that. It might be an occupational hygienist like myself. I work for an approved inspection authority, and we might then come in and just independently look at the risk. Certainly, the higher the complexity of the risk, the higher the requirement is for a competent person to actually have a look at that and do the risk. So for your simple and less complex situation, assessment can be just a discussion with employees based on the knowledge and experience of those employees. So your employees are very much the crux of these risk assessments. And it doesn't matter whether you are a highly competent person in the risk assessment arena that you're functioning in, you will always be back down to the employees and asking them how they interact with this environment in the way that they do. So the less complex the situation, absolutely it can be done in-house, and you should be able to do most of your risks through your organization like that. So let's just have a closer look at this probability and the severity scales, because it's very important that we understand how to assign probability and severity from the low to medium to the high. So we know that we can say, if we're looking at a situation and we're looking at a task, we can look at it and say, okay, this is a low probability activity because it does not occur regularly. Exposure expected to be very low. So very low chance of somebody stepping through something, falling off something, being exposed to something. You get a lot of places probably inside your organization, perhaps, where you've got very low work activity areas, like say maybe your compressor room. And so you'd have a very low probability of somebody working there. However, if you've got a very high activity area with lots of moving machinery and pinch points and places where people can get hurt, like maybe conveyor systems or forklift truck activity where you've got a lot of physical impacts as well, then your probability becomes very, very high as well. So it's got to do with how many people being exposed, how long they're being exposed for, and how often they're being exposed. Then you've got your severity scale. So your severity can be on a safety scale as well, which is around slipping, tripping, being crushed, being pulled into a piece of moving machinery, anything like that. And that will obviously all be very high severity type of consequences, because you'll have irreversible health effects. I mean, somebody losing an arm or a hand or a finger, an eye, any of those things are very, very severe. Somebody developing a severe disease from being exposed to noise, excessive noise, dangerous chemicals like asbestos, isocyanates in spray painting, and those sorts of things. Very high severity type of tasks. So those are irreversible health effects, or very, very major events where somebody can get hurt. So you'd look at it like that, and from that perspective. Then on the medium side, the activity occurs from time to time. Exposure is possible. So medium is it's not the one that I like the most. I try to avoid using medium a lot, but you often do end up in that thing, and you just go, okay, look, it could be pretty bad, but it's certainly not low and it's not high. It does happen sometimes. And so you're really going to try and differentiate your highs from your lows, and that is one of the better ways to prioritize and work there from that point of view. Then on your high activity side of it, if it occurs regularly, so if it's routine and it's throughout the day, continuous, 5 times an hour, once an hour for the entire thing, I'd say that's actually quite a regular occurrence as well, depending again on the frequency and duration of that exposure. That actually adds to your probability. Then again, back into the severity, if you're looking at on the medium to the low side, so severe, reversible, irreversible effects of concern, sprains, strains, localized burns, so nothing too serious, but on the low side, the reversible health effects of little or no concern. So if somebody is just doing a very low risk activity, you would actually think that they would even if they had to be exposed to a dust, let's call it a high probability, but the dust is very, very low severity type of dust. I want to say a sugar dust, but sugar dust does cause problems, but we get exposed to sugar all the time. But you could see that if you've got a very high probability of exposure, you could actually have a very low severity for a low risk, and you would end up in that intersect at a medium risk. If you look at those two things, if you look at that scale on the right-hand side of the screen, you get the low risk on the severity scale, and you look at the probability at a high risk, and you'd end up with you'd be stuck in a medium risk as your risk ranking. So if we look at that, how it actually contextualizes into the table itself, this is quite nice, and within the guideline that we've developed, this guideline will be circulated, and you will be able to then use these scales to be able to navigate your way through looking at each hazard, looking at each activity, and then assigning the severity and the probability scales in exactly like this. And you can see then if you just look at those two intersects, how they would work, you'd look at them along the severity scale and then the probability scale, and you'd get an intersect, and you'd be able to say whether it's low, medium, or high risk. Then the next thing what we do is once we've got that risk ranking, we looked at those two intersects of the probability and severity, then we end up with just sort of a decision source. So it's low risk, medium, or high risk. And if it ends up being high risk, obviously, then we go investigate the process and implement controls immediately. So anything that's high risk is where you're going to spend your money. You're going to eliminate that risk by various techniques. So you're going to take it out, and we call it in our profession, we call it the hierarchy of controls. And certainly what you want to do is you want to eliminate the risk, you want to substitute the risk, you want to get it out of the process, you might want to isolate it. So this depends on this is where your expertise comes in about your process. So it does change by the type of process or type of industry that you're in. But certainly, if it comes up as a high risk, you want to mitigate it, even if you're using personal protective equipment, which is the last of the things that we'd like to use to mitigate the risk. But sometimes that's our only option because everything else costs too much money to mitigate. But what we'd like to do is once we put that control measure in place, we'd like to take it from high risk to low risk or medium risk if it becomes acceptable. So with the medium risk, you can keep that process going. However, the control plan must be developed and should be implemented as soon as possible. So you can make your decisions based on that. Low risk as well, keep the process going, but monitor regularly. A control plan should be investigated. So we always, even if we've got a low risk, it doesn't mean that there's no risk. Everything actually has a risk, and risk is mitigated by resource allocation. So as a business, we all know that we have to function. The first thing that we do is within that business to make profit and to produce things, but within that we've got to protect people. And even if it's low risk, there's a saying what we call a LARP, as low as reasonably practicable. And Stefan introduced the concept of reasonably practical earlier on. It's an incredibly important legal term. And if you do have the money and the state of knowledge and the technology available to be able to lower that risk, it doesn't matter if it's already a low risk, you can make it an even lower risk by mitigating it in a way under the definition of reasonably practicable. So let's look at an example scenario. Okay, so we're in a painting room. A stepped stool or ladder must be used to reach higher areas within that painting. It is assumed that the individual will not be standing higher than 1 meter at any given time during the painting activity. The assessment team reviewed the situation and agreed that the working from step ladder at 1 meter is likely to firstly cause a short-term injury, such as a strain or sprain, if the individual falls. So not a very serious consequence, right? A severe sprain may require days of work, though. Considering the risk ranking table, outcome is considered as a medium severity rating. So if the person did fall off, they would probably lose, there'd be lost time injuries. There'd be some compensation, I would assume, but it wouldn't kill them necessarily. So we can assign it then a medium risk on the severity rating. But now how do we tie into the probability rating on that? So it could actually, it could actually occur once in a working lifetime. And this makes the criterion quite low in terms of the risk. From the table above, which considers the severity and the probability associated with the room painting, it can be concluded that the employee is presented with a low risk, where the intercept of medium severity and low probability. Finally, referring to the actions table, the employee is advised to keep the process going, but monitor regularly and may require the development and implementation of a control plan. So you can recognize you might actually have a pretty medium severity, but the probability of somebody falling off a ladder is very low. So we end up in that situation where we've got a low risk overall. And then we can actually say, okay, cool, it hardly ever occurs. It's with the person, if it had to happen, they would be pretty, they would get pretty hurt, but they wouldn't need like hospitalization necessarily. And that's kind of how the scale works. So if we look at on our side, we're going to be looking at these types of stressors that we find inside, whether they're physical, chemical, biological, and we can just look at a few of them and see how we'd actually progress the table that Riaan presented on the pink side. We'll be looking now at the blue side, and then the risk, the probability, severity, and the risk ranking scales. So really important as well to get your company name must be on this form. The date of assessment is imperative because it's a snapshot. And as much as we try and look at tasks in a non-routine way, mostly we are going to look at those routine tasks. And then if we can find the non-routine, we have to deal with them very specifically when they do come up. So you might find if there's a non-routine task, you might have to wait for that task, might be a day, a week, a month, and then you will actually have your date of assessment relative to that task. And then very important assessment is done by. So that the competency is that is where it comes in. And if there's any sort of legal wrangle around there in the future, then we'd have to look at to see who that person was and whether they were actually competent to be able to perform the risk assessment. So if we progress where Riaan was looking into it, was you got that hazard category, which is physical. So we know physical, that's where it's going to I think I might have been lost.
Okay, Sean, I think you're there. Go ahead. We did lose you for a minute there.
Okay, thank you. Thank you, Ashraf. Yeah, sometimes technology, hey? All right, so what we want to look at, if we're looking at, say, now noise. So now we know that let's look at a welder. We know a welder gets exposed to multiple things. Noise is certainly one of them. If they're working with metal, they are definitely bashing, hammering, pulling, grinding, and all sorts of things. On the physical side of it, seem to...
Yes, Sean, your audio did break there. Please proceed.
Audio device problems, yeah. My computer's shouting at me. Okay, so you can hear me again?
Yes, go ahead, thanks.
Thank you. So that welder would be exposed to multiple types of chemical agents and all that, but we'll take that and we'll isolate those different exposures of the welder themselves. So we'll look at the physical agents, we'll look at noises itself, we get discomfort or hearing damage and that sort of stuff within the workshop. That's where he operates. So the welders, if we look at who may be harmed, the welder is doing the task. He's actually, let's say, he's hammering, he's grinding, and he's welding, and he's chipping away at the flux after he's finished his weld. But what are the control measures in place? Welders make use of hearing protection when using noisy equipment. Now, look here, we can be way more advanced than that. We can actually specify the type of hearing protection. We can look at the SNR or the SRR. We can look at the amount of mitigation that's required by each one of those devices.
We lost your audio there, Sean. Sean, we've lost your audio. Is it possible for somebody else to share on your behalf, Sean? Okay, so Prof. du Plessis, I'm going to perhaps recommend that whilst Sean reconnects and gets back to the last of his slides, should we perhaps proceed with Chris de Wet with step number 3 in the meantime, if there is a longer delay than what we can manage?
I think maybe we can take 1 or 2 questions.
Okay, great. Yeah. So
I will just try to get the. I think Sean is looking as though he's coming back on.
great. So
Can you hear me now?
Yes, we can. We can. Okay, Sean. I'm not sure if I should allow Christian Coetzee just to ask his question, or do you want to proceed? Do you want to go ahead, Sean?
I think let Sean.
Yeah, I think let me finish, because we'll be very close to finishing now, then we can turn over to questions. Okay. So just
Thanks.
very important that we work in through these severity and probability scales. So then we're going to look at the welder's exposure to noise. We know the probability is high. Welders are exposed to a lot of noise. The severity might be medium relative to the reversibility of the exposure. And then ultimately, if we had to look at the table and we had to apply those 2 parameters into
Okay, we've lost your audio.
going on.
Christian Coetzee, could you unmute and just in the meantime ask your question that you have, and we can then ask Sean to add to an answer that will come from the colleagues. Christian Coetzee, do you want to just quickly ask your question? Okay. I'm not sure if Silika may want to ask a question. Silika Nakamba, you had your hand up as well for a while. Okay. Apologies, colleagues. We do have a technical issue. So let's just see if we can get the presentation slide. Christian Coetzee, your mic's open. Please proceed. Christian, we can't hear you.
Johan, Ashraf, are you guys
Yes. Is that Chris who's speaking? Chris Sudovit.
I think Ashraf, let's continue with Chris too.
It's Chris de Wet speaking. Yes.
Yes,
I just
Chris,
want.
go ahead.
Ashraf, you will present in the next step.
Okay,
Right.
yes, thanks. I get it. Oh, so Christo de Wet is going to proceed with step 3 while we just sort out the technical issues that Sean is dealing with. So over to you, Christo. Please proceed with step 3. That deals with the risks with control measures. Over to you, Christo. Thanks.
Perfect. Thank you, Ashraf. So just so you guys can see my face, there's a face to the voice. So pleased to meet you, everyone. I'm going to switch off my video so to save on bandwidth. So firstly, I'm working from home with the possibility of barking dogs. So my apologies in advance. And good morning to everyone. We have a very good attendance. I see roughly 907 attendees with hopefully a diverse background. Thank you for that. Then our aim is to make occupational health and occupational health services acceptable to most, if not all, SMMEs. SMMEs have a cornerstone in our fragile economy, and I think we should all agree that SMMEs should be preserved and enabled to do business and remain open, but not to the detriment of employees. Right. So just as a comment to previous questions, I found that working with the department, whether it's the Department of Health, Department of Labor, it really goes a long way to work with the department. And from my point of view is that occupational hygiene personnel have an open communication line with the inspectorate. The reason for saying that is that if you feel that you have been given an instruction by the inspectorate, which is maybe unjust, we are a specialist on different fields, as highlighted earlier. So addressing concerns through your occupational hygiene professional who may potentially escalate the matter to the inspectorate where required may go a long way to preserve relationship and encourage dialogue. Sharif, I see that we are running a bit late. So I would propose that I would hate that we lose attendees because we are over time. So I'm going to keep my part a bit shorter to allow for questions and hope that the presentation will then be shared with attendees. There is a few examples of different control measures and a review thereof in the PowerPoint presentation. So, all right, moving on. So once hazards have been identified and ranked to determine the allocation of resources, usually capital expenditure, the subsequent step is to develop effective control measures. So to avoid, well, rather to aid this process, we have a hierarchy of controls. Let me just say, I see you guys are not sharing the PowerPoint presentation. Sharif.
Just allow me, I'm just trying to get it up running.
Okay. Thank you, John. All right, so while Johan is opening the PowerPoint presentation to aid this process, we have the hierarchy of controls. So just the next slide, please, Johan. Yes, so to aid this process, we have the hierarchy of controls, which is in order, well, no specific order, but elimination. I will talk on the order a bit later, but elimination, substitution, engineering controls, and then administrative controls, and then personal protective equipment, abbreviated as PPE. All right, so this framework provides a comprehensive guideline for designing sustainable long-term, with the emphasis long-term solutions to control exposure risks. All right, firstly, you will see that we have elimination control measures, which involve the complete removal of hazards from your workplace. For instance, if there's presence of hazardous chemicals, identifying and utilizing less harmful alternatives would effectively eliminate associated risks altogether, although it's not always possible. The next type would be substitution control measures, which involve replacing hazardous substances or processes or equipment with safer alternatives. All right, then moving on, we have engineering control measures. This encompasses the modification of your workplace environment or equipment to reduce or remove your exposure to hazards. This includes ventilation systems, enclosure, physical barriers, systems which actively safeguard employees against potential dangers. Right, but I want to focus most of my time on administrative control measures, which present several advantages for SMEs such as yours, compared to engineering control measures and substitution as well as elimination control measures. How can I put it? So engineering control measures eliminate inputs from your engineering company. There's potential process changes. And that's where you guys can still hear me. You are?
Yes, go ahead. Thanks.
All right, perfect. Thank you. I just wanted to make sure I'm not having the same problem as Sean. Okay, so administrative process in the all changes in your work processes, practices, policies. You can train your employees. You can communicate with them to train them on the potential hazards in your place of work with relatively lower cost compared to elimination, substitution, and engineering control measures. So by establishing robust administrative procedures, a comprehensive training program or induction program, at least for your employees, and standardized operating procedures, you can proactively mitigate your risks and prevent accidents or overexposure. Whether it's noise or hazardous chemical substances. Right, then administrative control measures often involve training and education of employees, which in turn empower your workers with knowledge and skills necessary to recognize hazards, follow safety protocols, and respond appropriately. And I mean, it's always good to empower your employees. They say happy employees stay. So lastly, administrative controls facilitate your ongoing measurement, the evaluation and improvement of your safety performance and the health performance of your operation. Then moving on to personal protective equipment as another crucial component of control measures. So I'm just going to abbreviate it as PPE, which is considered as the last line of defense when other control measures are not feasible or sufficient. So that's from an exposure or a financial point of view. So this includes various types of equipment designed to protect employees from specific hazards, such as your head, face and eye, hearing, respiratory, hand, food, and body protection, such as overall. So when using PPE, it's essential to consider the following aspects. Let me just see how I can. We are still on this slide. So basically, we are at the red one, PPE. So firstly, choose the appropriate PPE based on the specific hazard present at your workplace. That's where you identify that Sean discussed in the previous what hazards is present in your place of work. Secondly, ensure the proper use of your PPE to guarantee its effectiveness. This can include the wearing of equipment as intended, adjusting and securing it properly, and adhering to the manufacturer's guidelines and instructions. And thirdly, one that's often omitted is you need to train your employees to ensure that they use the PPE as intended, know when to use it, how to use it, and aware of its limitations. Yes, as well as degradation. So when it should be replaced. So furthermore, it's crucial to remember that PPE has limitations and should not be relied upon as the sole means of protection. So you can always substitute your provision of PPE with administrative engineering controls, substitution and elimination. All right. So lastly, PPE should be provided to all employees at no cost. You cannot charge employees. Although if there's, part of the requirement can be to trade old PPE for new PPE. But you cannot EPP should be provided at all cost, at no cost. So before I take questions on the development of control measures, I have a few questions that I usually encounter. So first question, what is the place of occupational hygiene monitoring in the control of your hazards? And my answer then would be to consider occupational hygiene is an administrative control which forms part of your control effective evaluation. So this occupational hygiene monitoring is usually conducted by your occupational hygiene professional, depending on your applicable legislation, which is either Mine of Safety Act or Occupational Health and Safety Act, may require that the occupational hygiene body be a accredited inspection authority. Then next question, do we implement the hierarchy of control in this order as it's shown in this PowerPoint slide? And in that order only. So do we implement engineering control or elimination before PPE? And my answer is no. So while you're busy developing your elimination, substitution, and engineering control programs, which should be documented, but it can also take a long time to implement an engineering control plan, to install a ventilation system. In the interim, you can implement PPE and administrative control measures as an interim control measure, provided that it would be reviewed once other control measures such as engineering, substitution, and elimination are implemented. I just want to emphasize the documentation of a control plan is of utmost importance to be in compliance with the Occupational Health and Safety Act. One of the new requirements, especially from the Hazardous Chemical Substances regulations, is to have a documented control plan in place. I mean, it helps to have all the stakeholders around the table, whether it's organized labor, employees, and the directors of the organization. Then I usually see respirators allocated in a lowly aisle in builders' warehouse. My question, are all respirators equal? And in short, no, there are different types of respirators for which is effective for different types of work, such as grinding, painting, and woodwork. So you cannot use usually there's a P in front of the filter, whether it's a cartridge filter or a dust mask. So if there's a P, it's usually for particulates, and it's not suitable for stuff for activities such as painting and so forth. So just to get some guidance on that. So in terms of the development of control measures, do you guys have any? What questions do we have in terms of the development of control measures and the control of risks in the workplace before I move on to the review of the risks of the control measures?
We are a little bit pushed for time, so please just keep that into consideration.
Okay. All right. So let me see. Can I move on to the review of control measures? Then we answer questions as a whole for both of these two topics. Ashraf?
Oh, apologies. Yes, proceed. Thanks.
Okay, perfect. Thank you. So the next step in your risk assessment, so after you implemented control measures, the next step would be to review control measures after some time. It's important that we ensure that control measures implemented in your place of work are effectively in control in reducing the hazards. And as such, the review process plays an important role in achieving the goal of your control measures and identifying improvement opportunities. Yes, thank you, Jan. Okay, so the primary objective of reviewing your control measures is to ensure that the measures you have put in place successfully reduce or eliminate the hazards.
Hi, Krista, is your mic open?
Their effectiveness, yes, Ashraf.
Okay, go ahead. We just lost you for a second there. Go ahead, Krista.
Okay, thank you. So regular evaluation of your hazards and controls in short. So as work processes evolve, usually new hazards emerge and what
We lost your audio there for a moment. Krista, are you there? Krista, we lost your audio. Are you there? Krista, go ahead. Stefan?
Yes, Ashraf.
Thank you.
So if it's
yes, I'm here.
if it- okay, continue, Chris.
Perfect. So to evaluate the control effectiveness, collecting relevant data is essential, and this is where your occupation program and the monitoring of exposures come in. This includes incident reports, also near miss reports, hazard identification records, and then monitoring data, employee feedback, and then, as Rian said earlier, observations from your place of work. So during the review process, it's crucial to identify shortcomings or gaps in your control effectiveness. These could be situations where control measures are not fully implemented, not effectively reducing hazards, and not adequately addressing evolving risks. And then so your risk assessment need to be reviewed, but the documentation thereof is of utmost importance, which includes the documentation of findings, corrective actions, and any changes made to your control measures. So documentation help to maintain a record of control effectiveness, demonstrate compliance with regulatory requirements, and serve as a reference for future assessments should you have a visit from the Department of Employment and Labour. And then lastly, it's vital to view the review of control measures as an ongoing process and not a once-off two-year exercise to ensure compliance. It should be a ongoing process. So by reviewing the effectiveness of your control measures, we are taking proactive steps in managing hazards in your place of work, which fosters a culture of safety and empowers employees to continuously improve and work together well. So this is it from my side concerning the control and review. And I will take a few questions, but I would just like to highlight a few questions which I usually also encounter. Do I have to review? Well, no. Do I have to redo a risk assessment once every 2 years? So redo? No. You need to review your risk assessment and document it in order to enable record keeping. Once every 2 years, you have to at least do your risk assessment once every 2 years, but it's better to do it on a continuous basis in contrast to doing it only once every 2 years. Okay. So do we have to involve employees? Yes. But also organized labor. So I think it's essential and best practice to involve your employees and organized labor because they are the ones most familiar with your work environment. And then there was a few questions at the beginning in terms of the competent person. So can you do a risk assessment yourself? Yes, best practice is to involve a diverse team, which may include an occupational medical practitioner if you have access to that, and occupational hygiene organization. All of these role players which will outsource, not outsource, but they will consult with specialists in their specific fields where required. So, and that's it from my side. I'm happy to take questions.
Thank you very much for that. That's Chris. Yes, go
Ashraf,
ahead.
I think I'll just finish the record keeping. It'll be 2 minutes, and then we can continue with the conclusion or questions.
Please proceed. Thank you.
Okay, so the last section is just the issue of record keeping, and it boils down to the fact that if it's not recorded, then it did not happen. And in the Occupational Health and Safety Act and its regulations, there's a lot of emphasis placed on record keeping, what you should keep record of, how often you should do things, keep record of it for so long, etc. So record keeping is very, very important. So basically what you need to do is everything you do, you need to keep a record of it. What hazards are workers exposed to? What are the risks? Was it high? Was it low? Who is being harmed? How many people are there? What control measures did you put in place? When did you put them in place? When were they tested? When did you communicate certain things with the employees? Everything needs to be recorded. Next slide, please, Johan. So this is just an example. Let's say you have a risk, an ergonomic risk. So you are in a packing house and you need delivery workers needs to load and unload certain things, and there's a risk of body pains from handling heavy objects or doing repetitive tasks. Then you would record that risk. You would say delivery workers are exposed, how many are exposed, everything regarding the workers, their names, etc. Then your control measures. What did you do? Okay, you purchased trolleys to move heavy objects. You have a date, and then, like Christo said, you will review that. Let's say in a year's time or 2 years' time, you'll review it to see is this still effective. Maybe the trolleys were stolen, and you just never purchased new trolleys. So that needs to be replaced. Stuff like that. You need to document that. Is the risk still the same? Is it different? Stuff like that. And then also, when did you communicate this to the employees? When did you do training? Everything needs to be documented. So the last thing we also in the presentation is basically what we said earlier, everything about risk assessment, determining risk, saying who is exposed, what are they exposed to, how many people are exposed, what did you do to control the risk, that needs to be recorded. And in the question and answers, I saw some questions about how should you document everything. I think the fact that it should be documented is the most important thing. How you are doing it depends on your specific organization, but yeah, everything needs to be documented and recorded. And that's what I have to say. Thank you, Ashraf. I am done.
Thank you very much. That was concise and short and to the point. Thank you for that, Dr. Stefan Linde. I'm now going to, I've just checked with one of the colleagues on the list, Christian Kutsi. If he still wanted to ask his question, he has responded to say that he's okay, all good from his side. I'm now going to, I don't see any other hands being raised. There are some questions in the question answer box that our presenters are answering. I think there's about 6 left. I'm handing over to Professor Jan du Plessis. We are slightly early now. We've gained a few minutes with regard to the conclusion. Over to you, Jan.
Thank you, Ashraf. Yeah, I think the conclusion, and I would like to ask Sean if there's anything that he would like to add on to after I finish, just maybe in terms of the step 2 part where we had to cut things a little bit short. But in conclusion, I hope that this webinar was helpful in terms of introducing you to risk assessment and risk management, that there is genuinely now a belief and conviction that this is a legal requirement and that it has a use in the workplace, that we try its use is there to eliminate or reduce health and safety risks, and ultimately to improve the overall health, safety, and well-being of your employees. And then just to summarize the 5 different steps that you can follow to conduct a risk assessment, with identifying the hazard, assess the risk of the employees being harmed by the hazards, to implement the basic control measures, and then to review and to keep record, as we concluded just a short while ago. Then, apart from what we have spoken about and presented today, we will distribute copies of this presentation. We've just listed some additional resources that you can utilize in your risk assessment process. And then also some other references that you can maybe have a look at that's not maybe that helpful in executing the risk assessment, but contains a lot of information on the theory and practice of risk assessment. And then lastly, I would just like to thank all the contributors that made this development of this presentation and this webinar possible. Thank you, Ashraf. I think if there's still questions we can do, and then, yeah.
Yes, so thank you very much. That was Professor Jan du Plessis who did the conclusion, and we've had a series of speakers from Dr. Stefan Linde, who dealt with the definitions, Professor Cas Badenhorst that dealt with the risk assessment process, Rian Rabadenos, who dealt with step 1, Sean Chester, step 2, and Chris Soeteveta dealt with step 3 and 4, and Dr. Stefan Linde dealt with step 5. So if there are any questions that the attendees have, they can raise their hands. Christian Kutsi did say that he's okay. I'm not sure if Silika Nakamba still wants to ask a question. She indicated a hand earlier. There was also quite a bit of activity on the question and answer box. We've got about 5 open questions there at the moment, and we're going to encourage the presenters to please just look at those questions to answer them so that we have 0 unanswered questions by the time we close. So until we have, oh, I see a hand now, one moment. That's Jan Johannes Barnard. I'm going to allow you to talk, Jan, and once you can, please open your microphone. Go ahead, Jan.
Morning. I think most of my questions was answered, but it's just the last one. I spoke a lot to Graham Chin. He answered lots of my questions, but my problem is that at this stage, there's no ergonomic guidelines. So I want to know, are NWU maybe going to work on it to get ergonomic guidelines for best practices when working? Because it's difficult to do a risk matrix at this stage on ergonomics, and especially safety agents are looking for it now. And I think if I have it correctly, the manufacturers also have a certain time to put the exposure rates on, but it's not now in South Africa. So I don't know, NWU maybe looking into it to say, okay, this will be the exposure rate. I think if they can go to my questions and answers, they will see what my questions is relevant and the examples that I used. Maybe it will guide them, but I think, is there in the future, will there be in the future any ergonomic guidelines for us to work on? Thank you.
Prof. du Plessis, Johan, anybody else? Starting with you, Prof.
I will respond. First of all, I think at the NWU, we have limited expertise in terms of the ergonomics. It's not one of our main specialities. So the likelihood of us developing some guidelines is not that high or probable. But I think within the ergonomic sphere, there's with the ergonomics regulations and also the specialists in that field, I'm convinced that with time we will see some guidelines coming to the fore. Yeah, unfortunately, I don't think we at the university will be the ones bringing such or producing such guidelines. but it is something that we can raise at other forums through SIO and SIOSH, etc., and to see whether we can facilitate the development of something if there's generally this need coming from those in industry and at ground level.
Thanks for that. If there's no other additional comments on that, I see your hand, Prof. Bardonos.
Oh, yeah, I'll come in there. Thank you. Thank you, Ansel. I was part of the technical committee that actually worked with the Department of Labor on the ergonomic regulations, and they are busy developing guidelines from the Department of Labor on those specific regulations, exactly to your point, Jan, to assist employers to implement these regulations. I've also responded to a question that was asked in terms of where do we go for guidance, and I've linked the question up to the website of the Ergonomics Association of South Africa, ESA. They are sort of the knowledge hub when it gets to ergonomics, and they are very helpful. So the first port of call I can refer you to is to the website. If you don't see it, I'll share it again in the chat. And there you can also be linked up with various references, guidelines that's been published in the past. I've got quite a good newsletter as well. So there's quite a few guidance notes there, but I do know that the Department of Labor is also working on specific guidance notes on the regulations itself. Thanks, sir.
Thank you very much, Professor Bardonos. I'm going to quickly ask, there's three hands, Arlo Kriel, Bruce He, and Henty de Vos. So I'm going, Arlo Kriel, can you unmute?
Hi, Ashraf, thank you. I just, what I want to say to Jan is we embarked on this in our company with regards to ergonomics, and all we did was we got an occupational therapist that actually did a course, and I think it was through the Department of Labor, to assess these things. And to start off with just doing your whole factory or workplace at once is going to take you forever plus a month, and that's without overtime. But so she came in, she knew what to look for, she did the risk assessment for us, and that allowed us to work on it. That's it. Thank you.
Thank you very much. Bruce, please proceed, unmute. Can you just unmute, Bruce? We're in the last minute of our time. Okay, I'm not sure if Bruce is going to ask a question or make a comment. And so just a quick last round of all our presenters. If there's a sort of a key take-home point you want to give to the attendees, I would encourage you, if you wish to share such a point, just to open your microphone to do so in the last, I think about 60 seconds that we have. Bruce has not unmuted yet, so I'm going to close all comments or questions from the attendee side. Is there anybody else who would like to just make a final point before we close? Okay, if not, just to confirm with Prof. du Plessis that there is a document, I understand, that you're preparing that you will give to us, and that will include all of the resources that you've listed also in the presentation, because when we share the presentation, it'll be in PDF format, and you clearly would want people to have a clickable document. Just to confirm that with you, Prof. du Plessis, will that be available in hopefully in the next 24 or so hours, so we can share it maybe latest probably on Monday or Tuesday with the attendees? Checking with you.
That's 100% correct. Yes, we will try to. I've seen from the chat, etc., that there's quite a need for fillable document, etc. So we will make an effort to get that to you for it to be distributed. Thank you.
Thank you very much for confirming that. And on that point, we've had a bumper attendance today in this particular session. It was over 900 people, and we still have 780 people listed in our attendance record at the moment. We thank you all for joining the session, and I'm sure that Prof. du Plessis will make sure that the contact details of the presenters would be available in that document that we will be circulating on their behalf early next week, as soon as that is ready. So thank you very much to Professor Johan du Plessis on behalf of the Northwest University team and the colleagues that they're working with, Dr. Stefan Linde, Professor Cas Badenhorst as well. Thank you for your contribution, sir. Rian Badenhorst, Sean Chester, Christo de Wet, and I think I'm about to repeat Stefan Linde. Thank you very much for your contributions, gentlemen. I think that the attendees and those responsible for risk assessment and ensuring that we identify the hazards, do the necessary risk assessment and evaluate the potential health effects and severity and so on of these hazards, and what preventive measures should be in place to ensure that we remain safe and healthy in the workplace, that they've benefited quite from your presentations. I can see in the chat box there's been, I think dozens of thank yous and I think expressions of appreciation. So thank you very much, gentlemen, for your preparation, your time, and your contribution today. That's it for this particular webinar on guidance on the management of risks and risk assessments at places of work. Goodbye, everybody. See you on the next webinar.
Thank you, Ashraf.
Thank you. You're welcome.
Okay.
Thank you, Ashraf.
Goodbye.
Thank you, everybody.
Thanks, everyone. Goodbye.